Hello. Now we're going to take a closer look at auxiliary verbs. Auxiliary verbs are those little verbs that can help us do many different functions in English. They consist of the verbs do and have and be, as well as modal verbs such as will and can and must. And they have several useful functions in English, which we're going to go over here in this video. We've already seen how auxiliary verbs help us to form questions. For example, are you cold is a question, and we've inverted the subject and the verb. Do you like spaghetti? Okay, we're using do to form the question, and we invert it with the subject. Have you heard the news? This is a compound verb, the present perfect, and we invert have and you to form the question. But we can also use auxiliary verb to avoid repeating the main verb. For example, Glenn likes football, but Andy doesn't. Okay, we don't have to say the entire thought. Glenn likes football, but Andy doesn't like football. Okay, we can just stop at Andy doesn't. Here's another example. I've never been to Morocco, but my sister has. Ted eats out a lot, and I do too. I eat out a lot too. Do replaces the entire sentiment there. We don't have to say, and I eat out a lot too. We just say, I do too. We can use auxiliary verbs with so and neither to say that someone or something is the same. Let's look at an example. A person says, I get up at 7 o'clock every day. The second person, person B, agrees. They are the same, so they say, so do I. Okay, do replaces the verb get up, and we invert it with the subject I. Okay, we're saying so because we agree with that affirmative sentence. Here's the inversion. But we can also agree with a negative sentiment. Person A says, I don't like getting up early on weekends, and person B agrees. Person B is the same. So person B, instead of saying so, because it's a negative sentiment, they say neither. Neither do I. I don't like getting up. Neither do I. Notice that we still use inversion here. I don't, and person B says, neither do I. But what if we disagree with someone? Let's look at disagreement. We can also use auxiliary verbs for that. For example, person A says, I don't like getting up early on weekends. And person B disagrees. Oh, I do. Person A says, I don't, and person B says, I do. There's disagreement. Here's another example. I've already voted. I have voted. Person B hasn't. So person B says, I haven't. We can also use auxiliary verbs to make reply questions. We use reply questions when we want to show interest in something that someone is saying. It's not a real question. It's more just an engagement, showing interest. So person A says, I'm going skiing this weekend, and person B says, are you? Okay, person B, it's not that person B doesn't believe person A, it's just that they're showing interest. Oh, are you? Here's another example. Person A says, I finally finished my project. And person B says, did you? That's great. Okay, this is what's known as a reply question. We can also use auxiliary verbs to contradict someone. For example, person A says, you don't like the lasagna. And person B says, I do like it. I'm just not hungry. That do is a contradiction of person A's statement. Okay? Person B could just say, I like it, but they have to use the auxiliary verb to show that they disagree with what person A said. I do like it, I'm just not hungry. Here's another example. Person A says, you haven't finished your homework, and person B says, I have finished, I promised. And finally, we can also use auxiliary verbs to make question tags. Question tags are little statements at the end of a sentence that makes a statement into a question. Okay, so we use the negative auxiliary verb with a positive verb. For example, you work here, don't you? You work here, don't you? Work is affirmative and don't is negative. And we use a positive auxiliary verb with a negative verb. For example, you haven't been here before, have you? Okay, you haven't is negative and have is positive. When we're really curious about something, when we don't know the answer, then we use a rising inflection with the question tags. You work here, don't you? You haven't been here before, have you? Okay, that's a rising inflection. But if we're just looking for confirmation, then we can use a falling inflection. Say, you work here, don't you? Or you haven't been here before, have you? Okay, well that's all for auxiliary verbs. I hope you enjoyed this video and do your exercises and practice, and I'm sure you'll get good at them as well.